Right, so now we're going to look at transformations that are stretches, shrinks, and reflections of a graph across an axis. So our first group of problems, we're given a function. We're asked to identify the basic function and describe the transformation. Okay. So in the first one, we have y equal to 3x squared. So clearly our basic function is the squaring function, the parabola y equal to x squared. And now we have to decide what transformation occurs because of the multiplication by 3. So we'll remember, first of all, multiplication is a stretch or a shrink when it's multiplied by a positive number. The multiplication by 3 is happening after you square. So when you input a number, you'll square it, then multiply by 3. So since it's happening after we square, it's a vertical transformation. And in this case, all the outputs get multiplied by 3, which will stretch the graph by a factor of 3. And again, keep in mind, a vertical stretch means a stretch away from the x-axis. In our case, all the points are already above the parabola, so it stretches those points away from the axis, from the x-axis. So again, just as a rough sketch of our original parabola, y equal to x squared. If they all get multiplied by 3, this would all get stretched higher. And this would be the y equal to 3x squared. Okay. In the second one, we have y equal to the square root of 8x. So clearly the basic function is our square root function. The transformation, again, is a multiplication, but now notice the multiplication is happening before we square root. If it happens before you square root, it's affecting the inputs. So this will be a horizontal transformation. Okay. And now we have to decide if it would be a stretch or a shrink. Well, again, keep in mind, when you're multiplying by 8, you're speeding it up. So it does not take so long. So it shrinks it in towards the axis, towards the y-axis. So it's a horizontal shrink by a factor of 8. Again, keep in mind, this is the original graph where y equals square root of x. Okay. Kind of keep in mind that out here at 16, square root of 16 would be 4. Okay. But with our new graph, because things are happening 8 times faster, when we just get out to 2, we plug it in there, that would be the square root of 16, which is 4. And so we get something that looks like this. So again, the points are moving in towards the y-axis. So that's a horizontal shrink. Alright, number 3, we have y equal to the absolute value, y equal to the negative absolute value of x. So clearly our original basic function is the absolute value function, which is our v-shaped function. Okay. What does the multiplication by -1 do? Well, remember, that's a reflection. Now in this case, it happens after you take the absolute value. It happens after the function. It will affect the output, so it will be vertical. And again, multiplying by -1 is just a reflection. Remember, a vertical reflection means across the x-axis. Okay. And then finally for number 4, we have y equal to square root of negative x. So our basic function is the square root function. Okay. Again, what transformation is occurring? Well, it's being multiplied by -1. The multiplication by -1 is happening before you square root. So it's affecting the inputs, which means it will have a horizontal effect. In this case, multiplying by -1, remember, always means a reflection. So it's a horizontal reflection. Remember, that means across the y-axis. So again, in this case, our graph, our original graph, remember, looks like this. The basic square root function. Okay. We reflect across the y-axis horizontally. So this will switch over to this side. All right, now we'll just do the reverse, which is a transformation is described to us, and we have to write down the new function. So in number 1, we need the square root function. So clearly, we start with this. We want it reflected across the x-axis. Remember, that's a vertical reflection. So that happens, if it's vertical, that multiplication by -1 happens after I square root. Number 2 is the squaring function. Okay. Now remember, this is going to be horizontal. So something happens before I square it. Okay. If you shrink by a factor of 3, remember you're making it go 3 times faster. So you're multiplying by 3. The cubing function. So again, we'll have y equal to x cubed. In this case, again, we're doing horizontal. So something happens before we cube it. Okay. If it's stretched by a factor of 4, remember we're slowing it down. So the speed is cut by 1/4. And then in number 4, we have the absolute value function. Okay. You want to do 2 things to it. We're going to do a vertical shrink by a factor of 1/3 and reflect across the y-axis. Well, again, remember, reflecting across the y-axis is a horizontal reflection. So this will happen before the absolute value. Vertical always happens afterwards. So in this case, we have 2 things. One happens before we absolute value. Okay, so again, if we want a horizontal reflection, we multiply by -1 before we absolute value. And then a vertical shrink. Remember, vertical is on the outside here. And then all the outputs need to get multiplied by 1/3.